live from New York. No, it's not Saturday Night Live, but it's an important and timely discussion in our alternative assets industry. Today's program is called Operating Under the Microscope, PE Firms, Fees and Expenses Webinar. So we thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Heil. I'll be your host this afternoon as we talk with Anna Anquillari, Julie Corelli, Blynn Sorelli, and also Nick Donato about this very important topic. I can tell you from these practice sessions that we've had leading up to this program, you are going to get a ton of information. These are very intelligent people, really know the subject material, and it's going to be well worth your time. They put a lot of energy and have a lot of enthusiasm. I think you'll hear that come through today. I thank all of you for coming. We have over 240 people signed up for today's program. They come from all walks of life. The good news is, normally we do something like this, usually we have 65% service providers and really 35% people from the industry. Today you can flip those numbers, at least as far as the registration went. We have probably 65% GPs and LPs and 35% service providers. So it's a very good mix for us. What I'd like to do right now is have each of our panelists introduce themselves. We'll start with Julie Corelli.
Hi, I'm Julie Corelli, partner at Pepper Hamilton in our fund services group. I spend a great deal of time working and counseling funds on how to deal with fees and expenses, either in the exam context or just as a matter of their ordinary course operations.
And I am Nick Donato. I edit Private Funds Management. You may know the magazine better as Private Equity Manager, which is what we operated as for our first 10 years of existence. We recently rebranded because we not only want to cover private equity, but infrastructure, real estate, and really any closed-end private fund. As part of that, I cover compliance issues, regulatory issues, accounting, anything that goes into the running of the private investment firm. And so with covering that beat, the fees and expenses issue has been a big part of my wheelhouse.
Hi, I'm Blynn Sorella. I am the CFO at Sawmill Capital. Sawmill Capital is a middle market private equity firm that primarily invests in industrial manufacturing companies in the U.S. We had to register with the SEC in 2012. We have not been audited, but I live in fear of it happening every day, and fees and expenses and allocations are something that I worry about a lot.
Hello, I'm Anna Anquillari. I'm president and co-founder of PEF Services. I started PEF Services in 2002. Prior to that, I was a general partner at a fund in New York. PEF Services focuses on private capital funds in the small emerging manager space, which is typically funds with assets under management of $2 billion or less. Our role is to really help firms navigate the fund life cycles and all of the changes that happen during those life cycles, and really provide for efficient and effective back office via experienced people and targeted technology.
Terrific. Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon and spending your time really preparing on this subject matter and putting together this program. Also with us today, we have Janice Shopper, who is in the room, and Janice is helping with the technical portions of this program. And we also have Marcos Fernandez, who is with Pepper Hamilton, who is the IT genius who puts this together. And back at our office, Rob Reese, who is also a very important person in getting this all set up and put together. So we thank them for their efforts. So you've learned a little bit about who's on this end of the phone. It's probably a good time for us to learn a little bit who's on the other side. And you're probably used to these polling questions from being on other webinars. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch one that asks what best describes your organization. So if you could select 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which one describes your best? And as soon as we get some people selecting, all right, I'm going to close this out. Looks like people are still voting. We'll give this another second or two. And here we are. You can see 51% of the attendees are private equity firms. 6% describes themselves as debt firms. 9% as venture funds. And then we have our fund of funds and limited partners being another 6%, and the others are 27. So it seems very much in line with the registrations that we've gotten for this program. So we thank you for that. But we're not done yet. On to our next one. What best defines your role at the private fund, at your role at the fund? So if you could select 1, 2, 3, or 4. And 5. Thank you, Julie. All right, another second. I think we're ready to go here. Okay, we can see that 22% of the people consider themselves to be the investment professionals. We have 40% who are tied to the financials for a private fund, 14% who are in compliance, and 6% who have some other role. And lastly, but not least, we have 19% of people on the line who are for some other type of organization. Now, bear with me one more time, one more question. We're going to do this again. And this one's going to be, what was the size of your last fund? So if you could select 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, I'd be most appreciative. Okay, it looks like most people are ready. Share these results with you. So as you can see, 16% are under 100 million. Most of these tend to be in the smaller manager size, really under 500 million. And then we have, about 26% that are above 500 million. So good audience. Thank you for doing that, and thank you for sharing that information with us. Can't seem to get the slides to advance here now. But let's just move on a little bit and start the discussion. Julie, one of the things we're doing, and one of the reasons why this is coming to the forefront right now, is because we're doing a survey together. Do you want to take a minute and just talk to people about the survey, how it came about, and why we're doing this exercise?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. We have had many discussions, the colleagues sitting around this table and many others, at various conferences where it became apparent that there was a great deal of disparate treatment of how people looked at expenses. And the more people you talk to, the more you would find that, hey, we handled that way, or what do you think about this? And there was a great deal of anecdotal sharing of information, but no real best practice that we could point to out there that would help people provide some guidance. And the fact that there is the grand world of issue of expenses, everybody's aware of, but how on a granular basis you would deal with expenses is something that isn't often shared. So Mark and I actually sat at a conference run by PEI that we started talking about, wouldn't it be great to have a way for all of our colleagues to hear how each other thinks about certain things. And we came up with a number of scenarios, which we developed over a couple of months, and then tested them against what we all would do. We found out that we had different approaches to the expenses incurred in the various scenarios, which are designed to give a picture of, maybe not a real picture, but a fictional picture of what private equity managers encounter in terms of expenses. We enlisted PFM, PEF Services, Pepper, all together to come up with a series of questions which resulted in a survey which is now out and about and I think due to be responded to by September 5th.
That is correct.
And if you haven't received it, I'm sure you could email any of the participants in this webinar and we'd be happy to send it to you. It takes about 15 minutes to complete and it does ask some very specific questions about legal fees, operating partners, regulatory expenses, travel expenses, entertainment expenses, where things might be too big, too small, and how those would be treated. So I hope you get a chance to look through it and complete it.
Nick, can you speak a little bit about how the response has been so far to the survey and also talk about, what the next steps are after the survey is done?
Sure. So we're in the process of reaching out to CFOs, CCOs, really anyone at the firm who is the go-to person for allocating expenses and where these issues are really front of mind. We're getting a lot of feedback, which tells me this is clearly an area where people need some type of benchmarking exercise. No firm is quite sure how their peers are going about splitting, say, a restaurant bill after meeting with a portfolio company executive. And so there's been a really strong demand to reach some kind of consensus, or as Julie was saying, a snapshot to see how others are going about it. We invite anyone listening here to take part in that survey. For doing so, you'll get a complimentary package of the results. And as you said, Mark, any one of us should be happy to provide that link to you. But what I also want to talk about, too, was just why we're receiving all the scrutiny around fees now. And it takes me back to 2010 when I first started tracking the private equity beat, and my editor had told me, good luck getting a lot of information from these guys because it's known for being opaque, and it's known for not always being entirely accessible to the media. Dodd-Frank changed that in a lot of ways. As everyone knows, if you were managing more than 150 million assets, you were forced to register with the SEC, and eventually that kicked off this entire presence exam initiative that was originally spearheaded by Carlo DeFlorio, and his team started doing this introductory tour of the private equity industry. Or I should actually say that includes real estate, that includes other types of private funds. And what they wanted to do was really get their head around this asset class. It wasn't part of their purview in the past. They didn't always demonstrate a great understanding of the asset class. I've spoken to a few GPs who had to sit with the inspectors and explain how something like carried interest works. For instance, that you're not actually paid until the final performance numbers are out there. Or if you are, and it turns out that those performance numbers are weaker than expected, you have to give that money back. So there's a lot of learning period. There was a huge learning curve in getting these inspectors up to speed on what's going on. What's happening now is that Drew Bowden has since taken over at the helm of this inspections team of the Office of Compliance Inspections and Examinations. This was a 2-year effort. According to a speech that Bowden gave at one of our May conferences, he is, quote, nearly complete with that. But I've asked the SEC for updates around this, and where we stand now is that they've done about 150 cases in May. I'm hearing that they're at about 200 now, and Bowden, according to some sources, that really wants to get to 250 before releasing that report. So I would guess another 6 months before we see any chance of that coming out. The scrutiny around fees now is also just a result of the fact that LPs are getting smarter. The asset class is becoming more institutionalized. We're seeing that in the back office as well. When it comes to allocating things like fees and expenses, it's becoming part of the negotiation process. I've learned that ILPA has in fact even invited SEC officials to some of their summits to talk about what's going on, because what they're thinking is, for these funds that have been examined, what exactly are the vintage years? Are we talking about funds that were created prior to ILPA putting out these best practice principles that set out some starting points and how you might want to have the LPA structured? because what they feel is that some of the problems that Bowden and his team have highlighted might have gone away after these best practices have been put out there. So there's a lot of curiosity around that. And then the third component is just that the media is picking up on these stories. So we had the April Bloomberg report on fees. I don't think it was a coincidence that that came out at that time. I think that this is the SEC testing the water on what they want to highlight as issues. You had Reuters report that there's now a dedicated private funds team to police the private equity beat. There's some questions on whether or not that's going to be a good thing. On the one hand, it's always a little bit scary to know that there's going to be some dedicated specialists who could show up at your door. But I've heard some compliance officers say maybe this is a good thing. Maybe having people who really understand our industry and who are responsible for supervising it, that will result in less chances of us being hammered for something silly. So there's some mixed opinion around that. And then you have stuff like the KKR capstone thing where is this an affiliate or not? These things just tend to create inertia. So once it goes out there in the media, it tends to snowball. Fund advisors are obviously responding to this. They're reviewing their marketing documents. They're reviewing their regulatory filings. They want to make sure that whatever disclosures are made, they can sync up or point to a disclosure to justify any fee expense. In addition to that, they're having more conversations with investors. Sometimes this is happening at the annual meetings. Sometimes it's an email that's spread around. I've seen a lot of variance in how CFOs and CCOs are doing this, but one thing that their lawyers are always advising is make sure that you document it. Whenever you are making that disclosure, if an inspector shows at your door, you can pull up that email, you can pull up those minutes from the annual meeting and state, yes, this was, I've given a heads up on what's going on here. And then likewise, we have some industry working groups that are meeting with SEC officials. I know that ACG has formed a task force, and they're having conversations with SEC about what they're finding, which leads to what happens next. And that's really still anyone's guess. We're not sure. There is the possibility of enforcement action. We've already seen clean energy face charges for misallocating expenses. But it's my guess that for many of the situations or cases seen by Bowden, they probably relate to situations where the SEC staff disagrees with a good faith judgment call made by the manager about how they're going about allocating expense. Because we're talking about half the industry here. So it's hard to imagine where we see violations on the scale of what happened at Clean Energy, which the SEC sort of described as one of their major cases on this fee allocation issue, but involved really far out there expenses like college costs being paid for by the fund. And so I'd imagine GPs charged with misallocating fund fees in the tens of thousands of dollars or less to settle. A more common scenario is likely a GP reimbursing the fund for any disputed fees before enforcement charges are even brought. Because when you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar firm here, these are going to be small-time expenses that the advisor would rather concede than seem uncooperative with the SEC. And then just as a last note, we're seeing best practices continue to evolve. There's going to be more disclosures. There's going to be more conversations with LPs. Clearly, greater thought is going to need to be given to certain costs like dead deal expenses. There's going to be some questions on how you split that across funds. One fund formation lawyer that I've spoken to floated the idea of capping expenses to a specified figure. So for example, maybe you cap expenses at 1% of total commitments unless LPs agree otherwise. Because it's not going to be possible to draft an LPA that determines how every possible expense is going to be allocated. There needs to be that trust between the LP and GP. But nonetheless, expect this to be an area where LPs are going to have more questions and SEC inspectors are going to want to see a lot of documentation.
Terrific. Thank you, Nick, for doing that. We're now going to, launch into another poll. This one sort of takes the view of, every private equity firm is governed by an LPA agreement, which is negotiated between two very sophisticated parties, and whether or not the SEC should be looking into these fees and expenses, especially since oftentimes, in comparison to the deals, they're not huge sums of money. So if people could vote on this, we'd love to see your responses. I'm scratching my head wondering how this is going to turn out. Looks like there's still voting going on. Okay, now let's post up the results here. Okay, any big surprises there, Julie?
I'm a little bit surprised with the few people who are affiliated with the LPs said no. Now it's only 3%, but that would be a surprising answer to me.
Remember, that includes funded funds, so they.
So they're on both sides of the table. The affiliated with the PE fund that say yes, that's a vast majority. I really think that's an indication of people needing guidance on this and looking for guidance from any source and trying to get it right. I do believe that GPs do try to get it right and do their best in making good judgment calls, and the challenge always is that those judgment calls are tested in hindsight. And you know, you allocate a dead deal expense, for example, on your first dead deal, and then it turns out you have a great number of those during the fund, and maybe it looks like there was something that actually was being done incorrectly. So other than that, I don't think that's too surprising. The people who say they don't think the SEC should be focused on it is 17%, and that I think that's an indication of that there's a certain amount of sophistication out there that people do feel that they have good judgment on what they're doing and don't need a regulator overseeing it. It's probably more of a policy statement than it is a statement that people don't need the assistance or wouldn't welcome the guidance.
And for your experience as being a fund administrator and working with a lot of LPs of different varieties, is this something that's really needed, the oversight from the SEC, getting between two private parties and saying, yeah, this is allocated right, or no, that's not allocated right?
So political judgments aside, because that's only going to get me in trouble. You know, our biggest concern is it's so hard for a federal government agency to get up to speed, to monitor, to influence, to guide, everything that Nick was talking about and Julie was talking about. You know, a very diverse industry. I mean, the difference between Blackstone and the rest of the world is huge. So having, you know, a regulatory authority come in, by their very nature, they have to be broad-brushed and heavy-handed. And I think I'm concerned of the unintended consequences that are going to result over a long period of time for the middle market fund industry. So I myself would prefer this cup to pass over us, but I just don't. It's not an option. It's here to stay, and we've just got to figure out how to best manage the SEC. And the larger funds have spent a lot of time and a lot of lobbying dollars in learning how to manage the SEC. ILSA has gotten up to speed very quickly on how to manage the SEC for their own purposes. I think it's going to be much harder for the smaller funds because we're such a diverse group, but hopefully some real progress will be made over the next 2 to 5 years.
I couldn't think of a better segue, Deepland. Having been all around this issue,
yeah, I actually looked at her when I said that. Yeah.
and now with a fund, and of course being involved with ACG's efforts. So the question is, you just add on to your comments.
So
I here, especially around the small, diverse firms, so their ability to push back.
I appreciate the comments, Nick. I agree with you, and I agree with you. I agree with all of you. I think that, you know, we are not a Blackstone. We're a small firm. You know, we're not getting rich on these fees, and we've got fee offsets. We've got fee sharing. It's also true that there isn't really a lot of guidance out there. So, for example, I'm worried about a $7 fee or a $7 expense running through my fund. So I spend a lot of time on small dollars because I'm afraid that at some point when there's an audit, it's going to sort of cause an oversized issue. And I, every day, try really hard to make sure I follow my LTA. Nothing goes through The expenses, I don't follow what my GP tells me. I get out my LPA, I read it, I say, okay, this is eligible or it's not eligible. And we try really hard. I work with another group of CFOs, and we're all around the same size, and we work really hard to make sure that we're doing the right thing every day. And it is difficult to compare us to a Blackstone or a KKR. We don't have those resources. We don't have those kinds of dollars. It's small stuff.
Julie, from your experience in working with funds and doing different things, the role of the LPA, is that, you know, it seems like the SEC to some extent is saying that's a good starting point, but maybe not the end point.
I completely agree. It's not the end point in the SEC's mind. In most examinations, it's a, to Blaine's point a moment ago, that gloss that you get from how detailed is your LPA, how well prepared is your PPM, how good are your books and records, do you keep minutes of the meeting, and all of that adds up to the gloss of the so-called culture of compliance, which every firm strives to get an A+ and 4 gold stars in that department, because that does set the tone for dealing with your regulators. Over the years, and I've been doing this a long time, you've seen LPAs go from 27 pages to 127 pages, and a lot of that is evolved through the sophistication of limited partners, the multiple negotiations you go through in crafting a limited partnership agreement, starting at day one, putting something out there which you set up, strategize to figure who's going to negotiate what terms. And the expense section has gone from a litany of A to H in the list of things to A to double H at the very least. And people try to deal very specifically with expenses, but the life of a fund is 10 to 12 or 13 years, and you cannot predict all the expenses that are going to come around. Nick mentioned earlier expense caps, and we have seen some people try to deal with capping the expenses. And in the middle market, that is a very dangerous place to go, because it is a long term that they have to live under that cap, and you just don't know what's going to happen. More focus in the middle market is on not making it a profit center in terms of your management fee, and having the appropriate expense offsets and an appropriate balance so that the management firm can continue to operate and operate smoothly and even grow to a certain extent with the management fee and perhaps a share of related fees. But clearly it's not supposed to be an a profit center. The long-term profits come from the carry. So back to your question, Mark, it is just one component that sets the stone, it sets the stage, and you have to live by it as the paramount document. But there are lots of other things that come into play in terms of setting the tone with the SEC.
Great, great. I just want to touch on the question that Carrie asked here, and it's one I should really done up front and let everybody know. We are recording this. We will be making this available on our website. We will send you a link. When I say our website, I mean PEF's website. So we will send that out to everyone so you can access. We will also be able to get the PowerPoint presentations that we had for this available there as well. It'll probably be a short description of the discussion we had this afternoon printed there as well. And I'm sure the other firms will be doing something similar, so you might have several places to go to access this, but we'll figure that out and make sure you're informed. For a few minutes now, we've had this quote up on the screen, and it ties back into some things that Nick had spoken about when he started off, when he said the SEC's completed probably 200 exams at this point. And Bowden in it says what they've concluded at the SEC is about 50% of the firms come up deficient in practice and disclosure regarding fees and expenses. And he, put a little more light on this by saying in some instances, investor pockets are being picked. These investors may be sophisticated and they may be capable of protecting themselves, but much of what we are uncovering is undetectable even by the most sophisticated investor. So, Nick, I want to throw this one out to you and say, from your discussions with, fund of funds and LPs and institutional investors, gatekeepers, how do you think they would respond to Bowden's comments?
Sure, and for the most part, it would primarily depend on the LP, because we're in a situation where a lot of the smaller institutional investors, your family offices, to an extent your endowments, they're relying on the larger LPs, or at least the investors that are sitting on advisory committees, to really be the policemen in determining what are fair fees. And until this entire fee issue exploded, it mostly rested on this implicit trust that, based off of an understanding of the LPA, we trust our fund manager to allocate expenses in a fair way. So to hear Bowden's remarks, it raises the question, at least on their end. I don't feel that they're entirely convinced that their, what's the quote, that their pockets are being picked. But it means to them that there needs to be more questions. They need to develop a greater understanding of how these smaller time expenses, which really could escape their attention when we're talking about managing millions of dollars, are being split between the fund and the firm. And as a result of Bowden giving some specific examples of where his inspections team are seeing some of these violations, it's naturally those areas that are getting the most scrutiny and the most due diligence by investors. But I'd be interested to hear Glenn's thoughts as a CFO who has to deal with this in real time.
Yeah, when I read his speech, I was upset because I think it casts such a light on the industry that is unfair. I think there have been some high-profile cases, and the numbers are huge, and they're great to talk about, and it gives the media a lot of fun. But I think, the truth is, with respect to fees, again, I said before, we're not getting rich off our fees, and we have a fee offset with the fund. And at the end of the life of the fund, if there's any offsets that have not been used, they're given back to the LPs. So in that sense, the LPs share all the way through in those fees, and they're not huge. We're running our firm with it. And with respect to expenses, we don't have the, most firms, there's 2,700 firms, his speech referred to, and there's, we're talking about 5 or 6 that have had these big issues. And so, our expenses at our level just don't make it to this large dollar amount. We're not picking people's pockets. We're not passing college or expensive jet trips to the Caribbean through the fund. We are being very careful and doing our best to make sure that it's all fair and the expenses are right and the fees are in line and shared.
Great. Well, one of the things that came up in our pre-registration was, and certainly looking at our attendance, we certainly saw there were a fair number of debt funds. We saw there's a fair number of venture capital funds listening, and they're all not, well, I put everything under the private equity umbrella. A lot of people separate out and think of private equity as buyout shops or growth-oriented firms. So, Julie, does this apply to debt firms and the venture funds, and how concerned do those CFOs need to be about what's going on now?
It absolutely does apply to all kinds of funds. Anybody who takes in investment money and advises about how that money should be invested. The Advisors Act, by definition, has an exemption for venture funds. So they may not be required to register if they are venture only and satisfy certain other conditions laid out in the rules of the Advisors Act. But there are certain rules in the Advisors Act that apply whether registered or unregistered. So venture funds that are venture only and therefore unregistered and therefore exempt reporting advisors still have to comply with the anti-fraud rules that are in the Advisors Act, for example. That goes to whether your disclosures are accurate. If your disclosures are accurate about expenses, then you have little to worry about. But as we said a moment ago, it's really hard to predict what the expenses are going to be over the 10 to 12-year life of your fund. So venture firms do have to worry about it. Same reason debt funds would have to worry about it. There are different kinds of things that venture funds have in terms of expenses and other transaction-related fees they may not have. But in the expense area, they'll have a portfolio that's much larger. There might be more travel involved. There might be a lot more investigation of earlier stage companies. than a LBO shop, for example. The pipeline into them requires that they spend a whole lot more time before they get to an LOI with a vast array of technologies, for example. So there's a different weight of expense that they incur at different times in investigation of deals, and that does make a distinction for venture funds, but it doesn't mean they have to worry about it less.
And you deal with a lot of small and emerging managers. Does the size matter here? Are they concerned about what's going on? Are they talking about it?
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing here is both from the regulatory standpoint as well as the investor standpoint, the trickle down of these assumed best practices based on media reports or based on, you know, the quotes such as these. And I think there needs to be a concerted effort on the part of funds and the funds advisors to really educate the investors that work with smaller funds, because the sophisticated smaller or SEM investors, they know that they want these funds to be successful. Whether or not a $7 fee shows up on the management company or the fund, it doesn't matter. You really have to keep things in perspective. And they're not investing in Fund 2 for the sake of Fund 2. They're investing in Fund 2 because they hope that this firm is successful and they'll get to Fund 3 and Fund 4. And that's such a key point. And these sophisticated investors, they know that it's a trust relationship. And the economics in private capital funds are set up in a way that it doesn't matter. The waterfall is a full return of capital. It doesn't say we're only going to return capital invested. It's a full return of capital, regardless of what it was used for. Plus the preferred return and everything else. So at the end of the day, if the fund is successful, it doesn't matter where these fees were allocated. I'm saying that in a very black and white way, and I'm sure the lawyers will argue the points. I know. But, you know, sometimes I have to say things dramatically to just bring it to a head that this, I believe, that this can be a real distraction to investors, to general partners, to CFOs, and it's not worth it, because if this fund is successful, it doesn't matter. Go ahead, Julie.
All right.
Lay into me. Go ahead.
I'm going to go off script here for a second.
Jerry Springer moment.
It absolutely matters, Ann. I couldn't, I disagree with you on that, because the economics are slower to return if the economics are going out the door to pay expenses that aren't legitimate expenses. You know, I often get asked, particularly for venture funds, I'm not registered, why do I care? We answered that in part before, and in my inimitable fashion, I think of other things I should have said after I get the opportunity to say them. So I'm jumping back to that question, partially in response to Ann's comment. The SEC has made it really easy for people to complain about what's going on. And so have you seen the institutional world become very, very sophisticated and know what expenses are appropriate, have pretty good judgment when you're an institutional investor. The people who don't spend a lot of time in that world, the high net worth individuals and the family offices that are becoming much more professionalized and getting there, but they're not at the same place as some of the big institutional fund of funds in their knowledge of this. They see an expense, even if it's $7, they can get very upset. And all they need to do is to go make a couple clicks on the SEC website and file a whistleblower claim. And if that whistleblower claim is picked up by the SEC, which is a significant if because they get a lot, that tip complaint referral can result in a lot of damage to the GP. And so you do care a lot about that sort of expense, because it's very easy for an investor to not understand and not see the rightness or wrongness of a $7 being treated this way or that way.
So I'll do my rebuttal, because I actually did admit that my statement was very black and white to elicit some of these nuances. But and it does go back to, there has to be a trusted relationship with the general partner and their investors. There has to be an active LPAC. And of all of the stuff that came out of the SEC, the disclosure piece, I'm actually behind that one. I think there could be more effective, more efficient communication between general partners and investors to avoid the, if it's a black box, I'm assuming you're doing something nefarious instance. So.
Very good. Nick, you want to jump in here?
I was going to say there's one other factor that complicates everything being discussed here too, is it really does boil down to the LP-GP relationship, and there should be that trust there. But sometimes no one's really sure what the trustworthy thing to do is. So I've heard some investors say, Form PF. Well, that's asking for some information about the firm. Therefore, I believe the management firm should be eating that, even though intuitively you would think that this should be a fund expense. Same thing with something like Form ADV, which my guess would be that this is paid for by the fund, and I believe that most GPs do charge the fund for this, but it's also a marketing tool in some respects. So some GPs or LPs rather wonder, if you're using this as a marketing tool, should you not be bearing some of the costs for it? So no one's really sure, even if that trust is there, what is the right thing to do here?
Absolutely. We need to just pick up the pace a little bit, but we have a couple other quick things I want to hit on before we move on. Recently, we were touched with one of the people who registered for this program, stated that they've been around for 21 years. They don't operate with typical GP-LP. Instead, they set up LLCs, which is very common today. You see a lot of fundless sponsors. You see a lot of SPVs out there. For the sake of this conversation, let's assume that none of the SPVs themselves reach 150 plateau, but you add up their 6 or 7 they have together, they do reach that 150 plateau. Does this whole discussion still apply to them? Do they need to be concerned about, as concerned about this as other, funds do?
Well, for the same reason that an unregistered venture fund needs to worry about it, they would need to worry about it as well. So I won't repeat those. But in addition, there are rules about operational integration, which mean that you may need to actually look at them as one enterprise. And actually, they would exceed 150, so they'd be required to register. Those operational integration criteria were pretty well articulated in the recent SEC enforcement action with TL Ventures. And that is helpful guidance to the rest of the world on the fundless sponsor side and is an important thing for fund managers to be aware of. So you do need to think about whether you're sharing email systems, whether you have co-managers across the different LLCs, whether you're doing other things that operationally integrate you and cause you to pass that test. But as we said before, unregistered advisors still have things to worry about with expenses and disclosures, just because there are certain rules of the Advisors Act that apply to registered and unregistered advisors.
Sure. Now, funds in a wind-down mode, sort of the same issue here. And this was asked by our good friend Gary.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. Over the years, we've definitely seen, and this also has come up as an industry topic, the difference between funds that are winding down but the firm is continuing, meaning, you're winding down Fund 1, but you've got Fund 2 and possibly Fund 3 in the mix, versus funds that are winding down and the firm is not continuing. So it's a total wind down. So, and I think this is going to be probably Phase 2 or Phase 3 of this fees and expense discussion. As people get more familiar with it and kind of hit the bigger topics, get them off the plate. There's a real problem with some funds that are winding down that don't have a subsequent fund, in that there's a conflict of interest between winding down the fund and therefore, reducing the management fee and other expenses, versus if you have Fund 2 or Fund 3 to live off of. And there's been cases, I can't remember the name of the fund, but that have absolutely blackmailed their limited partners into, continuing the management fee or tossing the keys to them with still a substantial portfolio on the books. And also part of this is because it's been harder to exit over the past 10 years. The investment period tends to stretch out. So I would say what we have seen and have facilitated with the help of some great legal advice, Julie included, aggressively winding down a fund, maybe decreasing the expense load. Do they need to be audited? Could there be an 18-month audit because you only have one portfolio company on the books? So all these types of ideas need to be brainstormed with the LPAC if it still exists. And there needs to be some pressure on the general partners to pull the plug on these funds. I mean, you know, you get some of them that they're existing with just escrows. That could be transferred to a liquidating trust. There's no reason why that can't be, that vehicle can't be right-sized from an expense and fee standpoint. So that's coming down the pike as well.
Great. Well, I got to move this a little bit forward here. The New York Times did an article and spoke about this Biomet transaction where they sold the company off. They made $2 million in profit, but then they also collected another $30 million in monitoring fees. And just because the company was sold doesn't mean, and the contracts or the engagements they were involved in technically came to an end. They were supposed to provide 4 or 5 more years of monitoring, and that was never going to occur. They still collected the full fee. And that was the discussion of the New York Times article. So, you know, and I think earlier in our introductory slide presentation, we had somebody quoted, Susan McAndrews of Pantheon, who suggested that, you know, these monitoring fees and these extra fees that are put on the deals are the crack cocaine of the industry. So, Blinn, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think the New York Times article, again, looked at really big firms, sensationalized the dollars. There were 4 firms involved in that, and if you do the math, they got $7.5 million over a 2-year period. So for the size of that firm, that's not a lot of money. And, you know, again, I'm going to go back to for the smaller firms that are my size, these fees are important to us. We have fee offsets and we have a give back. So I think in a larger firm, do I think that there should be fees paid after the point of sale? I think that that's probably something that should be talked about and negotiated. Perhaps there should be a cap on that. At our firm, we don't happen to do that. When we sell the company, the fee is done. So I think the article, again, sort of sensationalizes it, get everybody all excited. It's going to get all my LPs all in an uproar, you know, and they're going to get me on the phone, and I'm going to say, no, we don't do that.
Fair enough.
There's also some question as to what the other facts are. So that $30 million that's split among 4, you don't know what else they did. There's got to be justification for something. That's all I said. Always look behind the facts would be the only criteria there. I'll let you move on now.
I think Nick wants to chime in here.
Just one point. One thing that I'm always mindful of tracking the industry is its public perception. And there is a question of whether or not these fees are justified. But there's also going to be the question of how is this going to be perceived by people outside of the industry. And a lot of times the people regulating the industry, like I mentioned before, there was that learning curve. They wouldn't look kindly on this, and this would be something that would fuel perceptions of the industry as stripping portfolio companies of value. So there's going to be these peripheral considerations that could have a pretty major impact on how the industry is regulated. Or you might have public pension LPs, for instance, who are sensitive to the political winds when it comes time to make a commitment to private equity, and they're having to explain that. The public perception factor is going to be important there.
Excellent. We've already discovered disclosures at some length, but I just want to touch on cost shifting before we get into our case study here. And this is very much a situation that the SEC is focusing on right now. It's a situation when I'll use fund administration as our example because I'm so familiar with it. Where fund administration is typically, third-party fund administration, typically paid by the fund. However, if a fund starts and it uses internal people, the salaries are paid by the management company. So in year 4 or 5, they bring on another fund. They decide that their back office is, you know, it's got too much to do with keeping up with all the regulations, all the IR stuff that it's responsible for, and now having to deal with 2 funds. So they decide to bring on a fund administrator for both funds. So in Fund 1, those investors that have not had to pay for that out of the fund are now being asked to pay for that. So the question is that fair? Ann?
So, and I get back to the, investors and general partners need to make business decisions. These are sensitive business decisions. They need to take into account the resources at the fund and what does a third-party fund administrator bring to both the general partner and to the investor. There's some real benefits that go out to the investor as well for the fund having access to a third-party fund administrator. But I think there's a way of doing it, and there's many, many ways of screwing it up. So the way to do it right is, get the LPAC involved. Okay, make your presentation to them about the business reasons as to why this is happening, and then the ramifications. One of them being the expense for the third party. Like most third party professional fees will be handled by the fund. Get their feedback, get them on board, and then go out to a more wider audience. Explaining the business decision, explaining the benefits, and then also covering the expense question. But I am hopeful that that's not the driver. Really, the driver should be the business decision as to how to handle the back office.
Just for keeping this moving, I'm going to move on to the next thing. But quickly, Julie, we've got a question from Matt, who asked, what percentage of partnership agreements now have 100% offset or something other, 80 or 50 or whatever it might be?
The trend has definitely been moving towards 100. Recently, I heard, just this past week, I heard a fund manager saying all they're seeing is 100% offset. In our experience in our firm, it's still a lot of 80-20, and the smaller you move into the size of the fund, the more likely there is a sharing that could even go above 80-20, for example, 50-50 up to a cap, in order to support an operating budget that the management company has. So the larger the fund, the much more likely it is to be 100%. That is also, I think, influenced by the SEC's recent pronouncements on transaction fees and what they may be ultimately considering them to be, which is fees subject to broker-dealer registration. So that may be driving some of that too. But the smaller funds clearly tie fees to their operating budget and what's needed to properly run the fund. To Ann's point, what's in the best interest of the business running it, and having candid discussion of that with your LPs usually can get you to the right spot in terms of that sharing ratio.
And just quickly, could you just define offset for listeners?
Sure. A fee offset is a provision in the LPA for the fund whereby management fee is reduced to the extent that the manager receives certain other fees. So if you if you have a portfolio company and it engages in a particular transaction, you might be hooking them up with financing, for example. You might charge a fee in connection with that because it's something different from your regular management oversight you do as a fund manager. That financing transaction advisory fee is going to the management company, and the effect of receiving it at the management company is a reduction, either 50% of it, 80% of it, or 100% of the fee is the amount of the reduction of the management fee that the firm receives from the fund.
Great. Thank you, Julie. That was very helpful. Now the fun begins. We're going to put the gladiators in the ring, and we're going to let them go at it. We are going to go through a case scenario right now. It's a hypothetical case. We called it Dam Creek. We used 2 M's, even though most LPs will say it with 1 M. The real point of this case study is to sort of show the different sides of the issue. So in this scenario, we have role playing going on, and Nick is going to play the role of a small endowment and how they view things. Lynn is going to play the role of a large institutional investor. The other way? All right, I'm flipping that now. Julie is going to play the role of the managing director.
I get to be Gordon Gekko?
You get to be Gordon Gekko, exactly. And Ann is going to play her trusted right-hand person, the CFO. So with that, we're going to move on and get this started. Let's just do a quick review of what the LPA agreement says. First off, it calls for an annual meeting once a year so LPs can learn about the activities and the investments. The LPs agree to waive management fees. 100% offset is agreed to. Organizational expenses up to $500,000. And then all the usual language about how to split the costs and expenses. Bookkeeping, clerical correspondence will be paid by the fund. Preparing, printing, distributing reports to the limited partner, and the annual meeting costs will be paid for by the fund. Third-party costs related to the negotiation, acquisition, ownership, and the sale of portfolios securities will be paid by the fund. Transfer, registration, and similar expenses incurred also paid by the fund. Any regulatory expenses handled by the fund. Expenses that are allocable to the partnership as an investor or as a partner in the issuers of portfolio securities will be paid by the fund. Expenses of the LP Advisory Committee, Board of Advisors, Investment Committee will be handled by the fund. And then, of course, the auditing, interest expense, any extraordinary costs, and management fees. So, Nick, I read one of your leads in your magazine recently, and you commented that an organization had gotten hold of 7 or 8 of these LPA agreements and had some interesting comments about them. Do you want to share for a minute what they learned?
Sure, yeah. And whenever you can get your hands on these LPA agreements, it's always a great thing if you're a reporter in this arena. And one of the things that were highlighted resulted around the management fee waiver. What's happening now is the IRS has actually formed a private equity task force to look into this. So that raises the whole question of whether or not these management fee waivers are being formed to avoid taxes in some way. But the real highlight in that reporting was around, yes, if enough fees are collected, if any fees are collected, they will be rebated against the management fee. But what happens in a situation where if you collect so many fees, say monitoring fees or deal fees, that it eclipses whatever management fee the LPs would pay? How is that money handled? How is that treated? And whether or not regulators or the IRS takes a look into that is something that remains to be seen.
Julie, in practice, what happens?
Well, I think the management fee waiver is a thing that's been a point of controversy, I'd say, for 10 or 12 years. And there's a lot of IRS debate over it because it effectively recharacterizes income from ordinary to capital gain if it's done properly. More and more I see GPs freely acknowledging that their money goes in on a fee-free and carry-free basis. And if you do that and layer on top of that the ability to use management fee to fund your capital, there's a double benefit to the GP. So more and more I see people scaling back to, particularly in the middle market, to not using a true management fee waiver in the sense that you're foregoing management fee and treating that as a credit to the GP's capital contribution, and instead living with the fee-free, carry-free capital that they put in.
Thank you. Let's move on. So Dan Creek case scenario. The next is the initial investigation. 2 principals, one from Chicago, the other from New York, from the management company of Dan Creek, attend an industry conference in Dallas with the expectation that they'll be able to meet the CEO of BizWiz, a potential portfolio company based in Nashville, Tennessee, where they expect to come up which is a company that's expected to come up for sale in the near future based on some tips they received from investment banker friends. So they go down there, they meet the CEO, they have a great time meeting her, they take her out to dinner, and then they fly back to New York. But they come back to New York with the idea of starting the auction, getting involved in the auction, and come back to start huddling around and figuring out how to get into play here. So with that, these costs have been incurred now, and this is how, our CFO has decided to allocate them under the guidance of course, the investment professional. And I guess it brings us to our next polling question, which is, how fair is this? Do you agree with this allocation? Let me launch it. And if you could please click in and let me know what you think. Let me give it another second or two here. All right. Close and share this with you. You can see the results. And what is the issue here?
Okay, so you know, I don't know. I'm going to blame the lack of clarity from the partnership agreement. I'm blaming the lawyers. So actually, I mean, it's not surprising. I mean, it's funny. Glenn mentioned the $7. It's these little things that just take so much time and effort, you know, and you know, would be helpful to have a better way of more streamlined way of handling it.
Well, before I say, this is Julie now, before I
Step
start in
into
on
the
my
Gordon Gecko?
role playing, I want to give one disclaimer that none of the things I say here should be taken as the actual advice I would be giving to my manager. So now, putting my GP Gordon Gecko hat on, and what do you mean 71% would disagree? I think the $1,600 airfare and the taxi should go and be a fund expense. After all, it says that all the investigation and diligence with respect to potential deals should be fund expenses. I don't want to pay this.
Well,
Yes.
You're an investor in this fund.
Well, I do have to step in here and say, as your largest institutional investor, what are you thinking? This, to me, looks like a standard routine business conference. It was an industry conference. You were presumably going there doing what I expect you to do every single day with the management fees I pay you. So, and to pay for an expensive dinner and air change fees, really? That's an expense of, none of this is an expense of the fund. It's all an expense of the management company.
And what really happens is Julie, you know, Gordon Gecko says that to the CFO, and then the CFO has to hear it from the investor because somehow this came up, you know, some way. And so the CFO is in the middle of it, and I am trying to take vacation. So
that's really how it works.
Yeah.
And then wearing the small endowment hat where something like a $1,600 charge for 2 plane tickets to me would seem quite high. I'm wondering, are you taking first-class travel here? Surely coach is just good enough. I'd rather not pay for cuisine and that level of comfort.
Well, come on, Chicago to Dallas and New York to Dallas, I don't know what airplanes you fly, but that is $800 round trip each is not extraordinary. And yes, we would fly coach. We would never impose a first-class ticket upon our investors. But just the same, back to Ann's point, this is an auction process. We don't have the luxury of getting to an LOI stage already. So it was an auction process. We targeted that specific CEO. We targeted that specific portfolio company. And yes, we happen to be meeting him at an industry association where if we were just going to learn about the market, maybe we wouldn't think twice about having it be a management company expense. But here we had targeted somebody in particular. And look, it's going to work out. We're in the auction process.
Pass it through later.
Yeah.
All right, I'll give in on this one. Let's go on to the next one, Mark.
Fair enough. I'm trying to get there. But just, so now they're in the initial bid process. And during this initial bid process, 2 weeks later, they received the confidential information memo. It arrives in New York with a procedure for expressing how to express a preliminary indication of interest, which needs to be submitted in 5 days. Working intensively with their lawyers at their lawyer's office, they I'm sorry, right there we go.
There we go.
Thank you. Just a little technical difficulty throwing us off here. Working intensely at their lawyer's office, they formulate a ballpark valuation. They submit the indication of interest to the investment banker, and they incur these costs. And again, we're back to that famous question we have. And it seems to be when I go to these polls, we have trouble getting back to our PowerPoint. But with that, we're still going to try here.
Yeah, and I'm going to, as a CFO, I'm going to answer the question before I see the poll results because I don't want to be pigeonholed. So, and Julie and I actually talked about this, you know, back in the day. We won't say exactly when that was. There was a comfort level with third-party expenses going to the fund, and then expenses that were incurred by the people of the management company, you know, the airfare, things like that, be a management company expense. So, and as you can see there, like, you know, the legal certainly fund, you know, but we did debate about things like airfare, hotel, you know, how do you separate, you know, the expenses that attend the person from the management company who is going to do their work on behalf of the management company. So, so we came up with this hodgepodge. So what do they say? Oh, good. It's not so it's not so black and white. That's a little relieved.
Well, what does our small endowment have to say about this?
As someone who doesn't regularly come across these expenses, I would reiterate, as a small endowment, I'm going to largely rely on the Cornerstone Investors and Advisory Committee to walk me through whether or not these are fair charges or not.
Nice one. Well, I have to say, again, as your largest institutional investor, really these men don't have, or women, don't have homes to live in. We have to pay for hotel rooms and meeting and food and conference room while they're working out their legal documents. Can't this be done remotely? Can't they get on the phone? Do they have to live with their lawyers in order to get this deal done? This is crazy to me. I only would sign off on the legal expense.
All right, Gordon, you're up.
Well, I'm just surprised that our CFO wants to put that $1,400 airfare in the management company. Again, we have this debate over and over and over again. But of course these are supposed to be fund expenses because it's related to the investigation, due diligence of a deal, and these are legal fees associated with the deal. Look, we're in the auction process. Now, we went through with our LPs when we were forming this fund discussion of a cap for broken deal expenses, and I know that we're getting deep in the hole here with the potential that the deal won't go through, but we negotiated that, and it's not in our LPA. And if this deal breaks, it'll not be because we didn't try, and we have to do our best to try for our limited partners to get this deal done.
But Julie, Lynn, you know how she is. Just give her a token, throw her a bone.
So my largest investor is now going to complain about this, but how's she going to know?
Okay, now that's the problem. She calls me every day because she read this article in the New York Times and she thinks we're all Gordon Gekko.
Well, I guess we should just take a step back and Lynn, put your CFO hat on at a mid-sized fund.
I've been fired.
And do your investors ever see these types of schedules?
No, they don't. But if this were presented to me, the only thing that would go through would be legal to start with. You know, broken deal costs are a line item on our financial statements. And so I've only had broken deal costs go through a couple times, and one time it was fairly substantial, and I was expecting phone calls and got none.
Okay, very good. And one of our people, as we were going through this great debate, chimed in and said, don't the IRS, SEC, and LPs realize that the fees and expenses are typically repaid to the LPs prior to receiving any carry?
I know, but that's what got me. That gets me back to the whole, this is just a huge distraction, and it really doesn't mean anything if the fund is successful, and then Julie slapped me around. So I'm not going to go there again.
And it raises the question, too, the operative word being if the fund is successful, there's definitely the possibility of no carry being achieved.
And then there's the timing issue. If you have a lot of fees that are paid, it is pushing more to the back end. And these fees are, of course I have my legal hat on now, my Gordon Gekko hat on. These fees are at least associated truly with the business of the firm. So far, they have been things that haven't been first class. We don't know about the hotel, but presumably it's a reasonable hotel, people are working very hard to get a deal done, et cetera. That's helpful facts in saying that the expense is appropriate for a fund.
Throw your lawyer hat just for a second, Julie, because we had a question. And we'll work it right in here into our case scenario. If the LPA agreement had only said source and close deals, would that have changed this discussion at all?
That means that somebody has an LPA out there, that person that says that the fund expenses include expenses incurred to source and close deals. Sourcing is largely a part of the management company's role. That is what you're paying the management company for. Once you have sourced a deal, and to Ann's point earlier, you have third parties that you need to bring in to help you to complete the deal. Those third party expenses are pretty clearly deal expenses. They're not out there canvassing the market or building brands so that deals come to you, which is the sourcing function. So I would take issue with the word sourcing if that says that was a fund expense, and I think you would find a lot of pushback on that from investors in today's LPAs, whereas 10 years ago you wouldn't have.
And not only that, too, but it reminds me again of how when LPs are scrutinizing these fees, they keep going back to, right, that this is the fund cost, i.e. it's owned by us, it should be for us. If in any way benefits the management firm or its staff and partners, they start to become more curious as to why they're eating all the costs. We're using the example here of going to an industry conference. If one of those deal partners that had flown to it was speaking on stage and that was building the firm's brand, or if they attended a number of panels in which their knowledge of the industry and the market is being advanced for not just that one fund, but the family of funds underneath the management company, you might get some pushback from LPs saying that this is something that's benefiting the firm, not just this one fund.
And going to the point as to when do the LPs get all this information, all this stuff typically comes out when you're fundraising. And it's the most awkward time ever to be having these 20/20 hindsight conversations about what exactly the role was and the purpose.
There's also what's known as a books and records request under Delaware law and most applicable state laws, which allow people to come in and look at this. So if you do have a disgruntled investor, while you might put certain parameters and conditions upon that books and records review, they generally are going to be able to come in and see this, assuming you can come to agreement on those conditions. And those conditions have to be reasonable and have to be related to the situation at hand, as does the request. But that's a circumstance where if things haven't been disclosed and now you have these line items in here for first-class airfare or for something, we're going to get to the egregious one, but something like that, that can really throw off your relationship, and trust goes out the window real fast.
Great. Well, I have to move this along because we're getting close to the end here. So we have a fair amount of material still to go through, and we have questions piling in. So we're going to try to get the questions. We may do that after this webinar is over and send you answers directly if we don't get it done during the webinar. So we thank you for the questions and keep them coming. But we got to get everybody back into their roles now. We're back on the Dan Creek case scenario. And the good news is, you know, the initial indication, what got you to the next stage, this involves marking up the transaction document. The markup is, of course, prepared by outside counsel with input from an accounting firm and the deal team. The deal team also thinks it needs a little help on this deal, so it engages a service firm to do background checks. Its regular lawyers are doing the legal due diligence. They have another law firm doing some analysis of the IP litigation, a consultant drafting up a 100-day plan, a law firm specifically to analyze a piece of IP, the IP protection strategy, a consultant to assist in the management team in gaining a better understanding of the market for the target company's products, and a consultant to review the sales and regulatory risks. But unfortunately, you know, they got a word back from the company. BizWiz says, we really love you guys, enjoyed our dinner, but unless you could do a little better on price, we're not interested. So the bid's rejected, but the Dan Creek partners decide they want to move forward. So they resubmit the bid. raising it by 20%, and also making it a, well, for this conversation, covenant light, if you will, type of document where they take out a lot of the protections they would have had in. Based on that, we come to this expense allocation. So, and I got to imagine Julie's loving you right now.
Yeah, I'm on board now. This is a real deal. We're aggressively, you know, hence the 20% bump up. We're aggressively going after it. And really the token to Blinn is the 6,000 market consultant, because that, you know, is a little bit more vague. The rest of it is specifically attributable to this transaction.
Really? The 100-day plan is being passed through the fund? That is what I expect your job to be. Once you buy this company, you should know what you want to do for the 100 days. You shouldn't be buying or paying a consultant to give you that advice, because if they make up that advice, they give it to you, how well are you actually going to follow it? The 100-day plan is absolutely management company expense, management company expertise. The fund should never be paying for that.
Gecko?
Well, I'll have to take this important investor out to lunch and teach them how things are done in the private equity industry, because the 100-day plan is an appropriate portfolio company expense, and we're going to own 100% of this portfolio company, of course, but for the piece that goes off to management. So what difference does it make? You know, we're going to pay this now, we're going to close this deal, and if it's a broken deal expense, we would have said it would have been a portfolio company expense and therefore should be a broken deal expense of the fund. But I'll have to do some education, apparently.
So very quickly, you can see what the people out in our audience thought. Any surprises in there to anybody?
It's about time they started agreeing with me.
You're very convincing.
I do want to note about the 20% increase. If anybody asks me, such as my large investor to my left, why we might have maybe been a little too wedded to our deal by having all these expenses that we've passed through the fund and defeated our IRR in the process, we had to increase by 20%. No, we didn't do it because we were so wedded to the deal because of the expenses. We were so wedded to the deal because we loved the business.
The opportunity, absolutely.
Hopefully that'll bear out.
Staying in the game here. Well, they decided that winning this contest, not only did they have to increase to 20%, but they really better make nice with the management team of the company. So one of the principals of the firm decided to go down and take everybody at the firm to a World Cup soccer game. And this soccer game was played in Brazil. They flew out in a private jet, which the company owned, and they had a great time. So, Julie, you turned it over to Ann, and you said allocate these costs, and that's what you came up with. Are you happy with it?
Well, we had quite a debate over the private jet and whether that should be a management company expense. I actually was thinking maybe we should split it because, you know, we did reimburse them for all the fuels. It was a private jet. It was very luxurious. It's not the way we usually travel. But Ann insisted on it all being in the management company. And I know I'm going to hear it from my large investor to my left that that's not what she expects her management fee to be going for. So we just decided to punt on that one and put it in the management company.
I think your small investor might be a little upset, too.
Apparently Gordon Gecko doesn't care about his small investor.
I would wonder just why we need to do this World Cup trip to advance along the deal process. Surely, if the economics make sense, some of the sweetheart stuff shouldn't be passed along to the fund. And moreover, I would have questions about things like the Bribery Act and whether or not that falls into this.
Well, funny you should bring that up because during this trip there was a little piece of discovery that took place, and that was the CEO of BizWiz just happens to be the daughter of a trustee of a U.S. pension fund that is an investor in the fund. So, Julie, how did this make you feel?
Well, the trustee and the pension fund were already one of our investors, so clearly we're not trying to influence the investor to come on board into our fund because they're already there. And it was a surprise to us. It's not a fact that we're comfortable with, and I have to defer to my chief compliance officer on issues like that. So that's what I did. And the CCO will talk with outside counsel, and I've asked them to come back and advise me.
So the CCO is also your CFO in this case. So, Ann, how did that make you feel?
So this is when I go in a rant about investment professionals. Like, how did they not know that? How did this not come up? You know, don't they know who the investors are? And then after I calm down, I say to myself, I'm going to put into I'm going to have a training session for investment professionals with required attendance, and you know, to make sure that they're aware of these types of things that need to be brought up in the forefront of a deal investigation. And then I'm hoping our lawyer can really help me document and disclose, and you know, make sure that the trustee is comfortable with what happened, and then bury this thing so it never sees the light of day again.
So, Brent, being you happen to see this disclosure, you find out this BizWiz company is somehow related to another investor in the fund, and you're the lead investor here, and Nick, you're a small investor. You're not that U.S. pension fund, so kind of put it out to you guys. This comes across your desk. You're reading the footnote, maybe. How do you feel?
I'm feeling a little nervous. I'm wondering why the cornerstone investor, the large LP, who I really rely on to monitor the GP, all of a sudden has this possible conflict of interest. And I'm wondering, too, is there another fundraising in the works in the next few months or down the line? Should I be concerned about that?
This wasn't related to me.
Right. That was not related to you. I just want to be clear.
I'm not that big investor that is a trustee. Well, the first thing I have to ask is, as one of your biggest investors, how in the world did this get by you guys? But didn't this come out along the way? And I am highly suspicious of this $10,000 World Cup expense. I'm really nervous with this whole thing, and I want to see a full timeline of how this deal went down. I'm also suspicious that now I'm looking back at that 20% increase. Now I'm a little more concerned about what drove that, and I want a full account of everything.
And the fact that it was disclosed in the footnotes, does that bother you some?
I would have expected a phone call, if not a personal visit, to talk about this.
We just had the personal visit in the last question, so we haven't had discussion of the education. Well, look, we got some advice from our lawyers on this expense, and of course, the answer was it depends, and the range of options that we have available to us are to not do the deal, walk away from everything, have the management company take all the expense, do the deal, and somehow disclose it to all involved. And by the way we missed it was the background check company missed it. We asked them to do their job, and apparently they didn't do their job. Wasn't our fault. And we can go forward with the deal, the lawyers say, but maybe we don't have the opportunity to take management fee from this investor if they are investing in our next fund. So maybe that will influence what the size of our next fund is. But we're still thinking about a lot of these issues associated with this expense because it did catch us by surprise, and we apologize for that.
But the deal is a good deal, right?
But the deal is a good deal, and we do want to go forward with it.
Good, because we got a whole other slide on that. So Sand Creek makes it to the third round here. And they are asked to submit a formal LOI. They have an exclusive for 20 days. They hammer out, they work hard, they get it done in 18 days. They then go on and negotiate the financing for the transaction. And after that they are proud owners of an 85% of BizWiz. And of course, in celebration, the investment bankers takes everyone to New Orleans. And as a result of all this activity, we have these expenses showing up, and this is the allocation for it. So we will do our one last poll, and we have to do this quickly because we're running out of time here. And if you would tell us if you agree with this or don't agree, I'd be greatly appreciative. You can see they're flooding in with answers here. Well, while that's going on, why don't we maybe start the discussion here about, you know, your largest investor, or actually your small investor, you know, comes to you at this point, and says, you know, that deal that we did with that company, related to BizWiz company, the relation between that, I'm a little uncomfortable. And I know I'm less than 1% of your fund, but I'd like to see a breakdown of all the costs and how you allocated those costs between yourself and the fund.
Yeah, and I hate these requests because it's such a slippery slope. Because best practices would say, whatever information you disclose to one investor, you should disclose to all investors. So to have a meeting with a full disclosure and kind of a blow-by-blow with a small investor, you know, puts us in a bit of an uncomfortable position. Because it's one thing if you have conversations with your LPAC, but, you know, anything that gets disclosed, again, you have to kind of treat everyone equally. So I go to Julie and I explain the situation and I say, you know, honestly, I think we handled everything appropriately. We did the proper disclosures. We kept the investors on the LPAC advised. You know, but maybe because there's such scuttlebutt because of the World Cup, because of the daughter, you know, maybe we should put out a letter to all investors, kind of just, you know, an overview and part of our communication open door policy.
So how do you respond to that?
I'm just giving a vague answer, really, and I'm hoping she has to, you know, pull the trigger.
Well, it's we've listed these as fund expenses, but you know, as you know, the reimbursement comes from the portfolio company because we got the deal closed, and it was a tremendous amount of effort. I think it's going to be a great deal for the fund. I think it's appropriate to talk about expenses and our methodology with investors, but to get into investors second-guessing the absolute dollar amounts we put on each line item, I'm really not interested in doing that. You know, the investment bankers did the right thing. They, for a big fee, they picked up the tab for New Orleans, and everybody had a great time. It was good, and I think we should just put it all behind us and move on to the 100-day plan implementation for this company.
You know, you're at your annual meeting here, and Nick spoke to Flynn about it. And Flynn, what do you think of this? Would you like to see a breakdown as well?
I would like to see a breakdown with an explanation so that I can determine whether or not these were really fund expenses or the management company should pick them up. The categories are vague and the dollar amounts are large, and I think I need more detail to understand what is accounting. Is that your accounting team or was that quality of earnings? So I need more detail to even assess whether or not I think this is appropriate.
Great. As you can see, the people who looked at this allocation, probably the highest percentage we've had all afternoon on agreement here. 44% agreed and 56 said no. So you're getting more popular with them, man.
But I think this brings out a really good example about how distracting these types of things could be. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, Dams Creek got a great company. Let's assume it works out for now. You know, however, and you know, but it could get mired in these conversations, and it's distraction not only by the GP and the CFO, but also the investors, and it takes their eye off the ball.
Well, thank you all for doing a tremendous job. Big round of applause for our panelists. And if you're clapping in your office, you're probably attracting a lot of attention right now. No, I'd like to thank all our attendees for being here. We went a little bit over. I do apologize. We try to end these things at 1:30. We're about 4 or 5 minutes over. I'd like to thank Brian Dolan, who with Pepper Hamilton runs their marketing department. He did a phenomenal job in coordinating between here and New York. And of course, with all the Pepper Hamilton staff and for hosting us here this afternoon. So with that, we'll bid adieu, and thank you for joining us on this conversation about fees and expenses.